They said she vanished without a trace. But what if she never left at all? In a quiet seaside hotel where waves whisper old secrets and every locked door hides a truth, one woman's disappearance threatens to unravel more than just a lie. It threatens to expose the kind of fear that doesn't scream, but quietly settles into your bones. And just when everyone thought the case was closed, a single key reappears, polished, fingerprint-free, forgotten by no one. After a particularly wearying winter marked by a lingering chest cold and a physician's stern advice to escape the damp air of St. Mildred's vicarage, Miss Elsbeth Marlowe, an astutely observant, quietly resilient woman with an eye for detail, and a history of unraveling the complex tangles of human deceit, decided it was time for a brief coastal retreat. With her typical matter-of-fact efficiency, she packed 2 wool skirts, a sturdy raincoat, her ever-faithful knitting satchel, and a slim travel journal bound in burgundy leather, then booked herself into the Cliffside Haven Hotel, a once stately Edwardian structure perched atop a battered promontory overlooking a brooding and indifferent sea. The hotel, now a faded monument to its glamorous past, bore the kind of hushed melancholy that comes when grandeur quietly gives way to ghostly routine. The reception hall reeked faintly of damp wood and lavender polish, its brass fixtures dulled and a chipped porcelain clock above the mantel frozen at 4:47. Miss Marlowe, ever alert to the details others missed, noted with quiet interest a peculiar sign thumbtacked to the edge of the faded events board. Room 9, closed until further notice. Odd, she mused, for a hotel whose concierge had only just apologized for having a single vacancy left. Room 8, adjacent to the mysteriously sealed one. She said nothing, of course, merely offered a nod and signed the guest register with her usual delicate flourish, making a mental note of the blank space beside room 9's entry. The room itself was modest, rose-patterned wallpaper curling slightly at the corners, an armchair too worn for comfort, and a sea view that offered more grey than grandeur, but she found a certain charm in its imperfection. As she unpacked, the faint strains of a scratchy phonograph wafted up through the floorboards, blending with the occasional gust rattling the window panes. But it was a muffled exchange on the landing below, hushed but urgent, that made her fingers pause mid-button. "She shouldn't be next to that room," a voice hissed. "I told them to seal it proper." A pause, then an older voice replied sharply, "Not here, not now." Silence followed, thick and telling. Miss Marlowe, now motionless by the wardrobe, let the words sink in. She had learned in parish life that whispers, when timed right, told more truth than any confession. When the tea tray arrived moments later, wheeled in by a pale young bellboy with darting eyes, she greeted him with her usual warmth and a question wrapped in gentleness. "Do tell me, dear, does room 9 often give you trouble?" The boy froze, then stammered something about old pipes and drafty walls before hastily excusing himself. Later, a flustered chambermaid named Elsie, cheeks flushed and voice wavering, confided more than she meant. Once, years ago, a guest went in and was never seen again. No checkout, no suitcase, no trace, just gone. Before Miss Marlowe could probe further, the receptionist appeared, her laugh brittle, and her hands too tightly clasped. "Superstition, dear. Old buildings attract it like dust, nothing more." But Miss Marlowe knew better. In her experience, places that people refused to talk about were often the ones that spoke loudest. If only one knew how to listen. That night, as the waves crashed rhythmically against the rocks below, and the wind moaned down the chimney like a warning, Miss Marlowe sat in bed with her knitting untouched, her eyes fixed on the adjoining wall, the one shared with room 9, and she waited, calm and prepared for whatever it was that had made others disappear without a trace. That night, the wind howled in from the sea like a living thing, a cold, angry force that battered the crumbling edges of the Bramblewick Inn, rattling the old window panes until they shivered in protest. The scent of salt and distant rain crept through the cracks like a warning. Inside room 11, Miss Eliza Hawthorne, upright and sharp-eyed despite her years, sat knitting with slow precision by the window, her lamp casting a golden circle onto the faded carpet, its light flickering with every gust. There was something about the rhythm of the needles that calmed her mind, allowed her thoughts to wander, but tonight, they were not at peace. She had not missed the way the receptionist's eyes darted away when she asked why room 12 was sealed shut with a chain and a sign that read storage. No entry. Nor had she missed the hurried way guests avoided the east corridor after dark, whispering about old stories and strange sounds. At precisely 11:43 p.m., the corridor outside turned unnaturally still. Then, footsteps, not brisk and purposeful, but uneven and heavy, dragging as if someone, or something reluctantly crossed each inch. They stopped outside room 12. A long silence followed. Then came the softest of metallic clicks, unmistakably a key turning in a lock that was supposed to be untouched for years. Eliza rose without a word, and moved to her own door, opening it just a hair. The hallway was empty, completely, but room 12's door was no longer shut. It hung open an inch, swaying gently on its hinges as though nudged by breath. Eliza stared, heart thudding softly, before closing her own door just as silently, writing the time in her diary with steady hands. At 4:17 a.m., a scream shattered the hush, a single high-pitched note that cut the air clean in half, then vanished. Moments later, the corridor came alive in chaos, dressing gowns, hushed panic, and slippered feet stumbling toward the sound. A young chambermaid stood pale as a ghost, pointing toward room 12, her words barely forming. "There's a man, on the floor, blood. He's not breathing." The inn's manager, Harold Dinton, sweating through his collar, and clearly out of his depth, tried to block the view, but it was too late. Eliza had already seen enough. A man lay sprawled unnaturally on the floor, limbs rigid, blood pooled beneath him like a dark halo. He wore an elegant dinner jacket from another era, the fabric torn at the shoulder, and in one clenched fist, he held an ancient brass key, the same shape and ornate design as the one she'd seen on room 12's door in the faded brochure in the lobby. In his other hand, twisted and soaked red, was a length of velvet ribbon, shredded and stained. No one at the inn recognized him. He hadn't checked in. There was no name, no luggage, and no trace of how he entered, let alone died. But someone knew, someone had let him in. At breakfast, the dining room buzzed with thinly veiled hysteria. The guests spoke too softly, avoided eye contact, and flinched at the clatter of cutlery. Eliza sat in her usual spot, quiet, observant, unnoticed. She watched the barman polish the same glass for 15 minutes, watched the newlywed from room 7 with ink on his cuff and something hidden beneath his napkin, and she especially watched the elegant woman in room 8, who claimed to be a travel writer, but had been reading coroner reports by the fire the previous evening. No one asked why she carried gloves lined with surgical latex. Eliza sipped her tea slowly, thoughtfully. There was something deeply wrong here, not just murder. This was old, coiled history snapping loose, something buried long ago clawing back to the surface. And in Eliza's long and unassuming life she'd learned one thing without fail: when a locked room opens itself to death, someone nearby already knows the ending. She just had to find out who before the killer decided to write a second chapter. As her untouched porridge cooled and the room buzzed with the forced murmur of breakfast conversation, Miss Agnes Moorcroft sat with her spine perfectly straight and her hands gently folded, her eyes calm but keen, silently observing the theater that was the Royal Gull's morning dining room. She had always believed human behavior revealed far more in silence than in speech, and this morning her theory stood firmer than ever. There was Mrs. Trevelyan, laughing too loudly at nothing at all, her spoon clinking against her cup with artificial cheer, Mr. Harrows stealing anxious glances toward the hallway as if expecting a shadow to enter, and poor Mr. Pritchard, pale as milk and utterly still except for the slight tremor in his teacup every time the dining door creaked open. It was not just nerves, Miss Moorcroft noted, it was anticipation edged with dread, the kind that came only when someone knew exactly what or who they were afraid of. Very curious, she mused, filing the observation away with the meticulousness of a librarian. Later in the lounge she found Mrs. Sanditon, normally composed and elegantly restrained, vigorously thumping the life out of a helpless velvet cushion, her brow glistening and her lips pressed tight enough to whiten them. "A dreadful business," Miss Moorcroft said, gently adjusting the brooch at her collar, her voice low and reassuring like a lullaby. But such things do happen, especially in establishments with as much history as yours. Mrs. Sanditon looked up sharply, her eyes wide, the mask of calm slipping for a heartbeat. Nothing like this ever happens here, she whispered, voice trembling. 32 years my family has run this hotel. 32 without incident. This is, she swallowed hard, it's a mistake. A horrible, tragic mistake. That man had no right being in that room. It wasn't even supposed to be unlocked. Her hands clenched around the fabric of her skirt, knuckles white. Room 13 has been sealed since, she faltered. Since, Miss Moorcroft echoed softly, arching an eyebrow. Since the renovation, old plumbing. Unsafe. The lie fluttered in her voice like a wounded bird. Miss Moorcroft smiled politely, but inwardly she recorded the stammer, the shake in her hands, the desperation not to meet her gaze. People who feared scandal often lied in small ways, she had learned, but those lies usually covered much older, far more dangerous truths. That afternoon, with the scent of sea salt drifting in through the half-open windows, she shared tea with Colonel Denham, who, though impeccably dressed, seemed flustered, his usually rigid composure dulled by the effects of a second or third glass of whiskey. Dashed strange goings-on, Miss Moorcroft, he muttered, swirling the amber liquid in his glass though he wasn't really drinking it. Saw something last night. After midnight. Someone creeping about. Quiet as fog.
Oh,
She asked innocently. Did you recognize them? He shifted, clearing his throat. Well, not exactly. Had a bit of a nip before bed, you see. But I remember the cloak. Long heavy thing brushed the floor as they moved. Looked like something from a stage play. Too old-fashioned for anyone normal. Miss Moorcroft's eyes sharpened. A theatrical cloak in this setting suggested one thing only, disguise. Someone had dressed not just to conceal themselves but to mislead, to be seen but not recognized. A calculated performance. As she mulled this over, Mrs. Winifred Braithwaite swept into the lounge in a swirl of paisley wool and self-importance, her voice already halfway into a monologue. I knew it, she declared. There were signs clear as day. The creaking on the landing wasn't ordinary. This house has its quirks, yes, but that was something else. Then the knocking on the window, 3 short taps, like a signal. And the smell, thick cigar smoke, not the sort anyone here smokes. I said to myself, Winnie, something wicked is afoot. Miss Moorcroft offered a polite nod, her needles clicking softly in her lap, but her mind spun faster than her fingers. Signals, smoke, cloaks, it was too precise, too staged. Someone had orchestrated a moment designed to feel like chaos, but behind the confusion Miss Moorcroft sensed purpose.
hey!
Then Mrs. Braithwaite leaned in, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. It's always a woman. Mark my words. Some jealous wife, or worse. There's always a woman behind these things. Miss Moorcroft's expression didn't change, but the remark echoed oddly. It was a well-worn assumption, often wrong, but sometimes buried beneath prejudice, lay an uncomfortable truth. She was still pondering this when Mr. Pritchard passed near the fireplace, holding a newspaper with stiff, nerveless fingers. He stared not at the print, but at the brass surface of the fireguard, eyes fixed on the distorted reflection as though afraid to look behind him. Miss Moorcroft watched him for a long moment, sensing not just guilt but fear, crippling fear, the kind that came when the walls felt closer each hour. No one mentioned the torn carpet outside room 9 or the faint music someone had heard through the locked utility door just before sunrise. But she noticed everything. The hush between breaths, the glances that lingered too long, the silences where words should have been. And as the sea murmured against the cliffs and the sun dipped behind the hill, she was certain now that someone in the Royal Gull wasn't merely hiding a secret, they were hiding themselves, wearing a borrowed identity, blending into the tapestry of guests and staff, waiting. Waiting for what, she didn't yet know. But the game, Miss Moorcroft thought as the shadows deepened, had already begun. Miss Eleanor Hartley, whose eyes had seen too much and forgotten too little over a lifetime of quiet observations, from skittish vicars hiding sins behind sermons to genteel widows nursing secrets behind lace curtains, immediately sensed that the gaunt, Pale man before her was not simply unnerved by the incident but burdened by something far heavier, a truth he dared not voice. "Dreadful thing," she said gently, lowering herself into the creaky armchair opposite him in the dimly lit hotel lounge, the ticking of the grandfather clock the only sound filling the awkward space between them. "But I imagine you've witnessed worse, haven't you, Mr. Latham?" The man jolted, his teacup rattling against the saucer. I keep to myself," he muttered, eyes darting toward the hallway. Voice brittle. "Came for the peace." "Naturally," Miss Hartley replied with an understanding smile, though her gaze lingered a moment too long. Still, a locked room, a body, and no sign of forced entry. Not exactly restful. Mr. Latham's lips twitched into a strained semblance of a smile. "Bad luck, I suppose." Miss Hartley returned to her knitting, needles clicking softly as her thoughts circled like hawks. Bad luck. Or a reckoning long overdue. Later, as the constable bumbled about room 9, she allowed herself a solitary visit to the crime scene. The dead man lay twisted unnaturally by the writing desk, eyes frozen in startled disbelief. One hand clenched tightly around a torn scrap of velvet, rich green and monogrammed in a style not worn in polite company for decades. A smear of rust-colored soil stained the rug near the bathroom door, the pattern broken as if the steps had stopped mid-stride or vanished entirely. The window had been flung open, but the room still held the ghost of pipe smoke, thick and spiced with something foreign. On the sill, faint scratches ran parallel like claw marks or desperate fingernails, and just beneath the radiator, a discarded cufflink gleamed dully, its design heraldic, noble, and far too out of place in a modest coastal inn. None of these things alone screamed murder, but together they whispered something worse, something deliberate. Miss Hartley requested the guestbook with a quiet firmness that brooked no refusal, and young Lucy, wide-eyed and pink with excitement, handed it over. "Room 9 wasn't even booked last night," she whispered. "We keep it closed for repairs. Mrs. Phelps says it's unlucky." Hartley's finger glided down the register. "Mr. Latham in room 7, the Everett sisters in room 5, herself in room 8 and 9, indeed left blank in the housekeeper's neat cursive." "How very strange," she murmured, snapping it shut, mind racing. An unregistered guest was bad enough, but a corpse without a name. That was dangerous. And in this hotel, an old place with stories etched into its wallpaper and whispers buried beneath its floorboards. This wasn't the first time an empty room had refused to stay quiet. By mid-morning, the parlor had become a nesting place for speculation. Miss Hartley sat beside the fire, her knitting now a slow and thoughtful rhythm, while Mrs. Templeton, all pearls and peppermint breath, leaned in with glee thinly disguised as concern. "Murder, if you ask me. Men like that don't just drop dead in empty rooms," she whispered, glancing around theatrically. "I heard the thud, around midnight. And footsteps, heavy ones. Then nothing. You tell me how that makes sense." Miss Hartley raised an eyebrow. "Footsteps in a vacant room are always worth noting. They say that room's cursed," Mrs. Templeton added, voice low, eyes bright. "Back in the 60s there was a drowning maid found in the bathtub, wristwatch still ticking. And before that, a man vanished completely. Checked in, never checked out." Miss Hartley smiled faintly. People always blamed curses when they lacked explanations, but in her experience there were no curses, only choices and consequences. And perhaps, somewhere within this tangled web of lies and half-heard footsteps, the truth was still waiting, cold, patient and far from finished with room 9. The rain had begun again, soft at first but persistent, tapping against the stained glass windows of the weathered old guesthouse like an impatient hand seeking entry, while Miss Aloan Gray, always poised and composed beneath her shawl, stepped into the hushed hallway, where an odd silence lingered far too long after the morning commotion, a silence that didn't feel empty, but rather watchful. She passed the grandfather clock whose pendulum now ticked irregularly, as if disturbed, and paused outside room 9, the door still sealed with constable's tape that fluttered slightly though no breeze stirred inside. The man found there had no name, no luggage, and most troubling of all, no trace of how he had entered a room that, according to every record and every witness, had not been occupied in weeks, a room with a broken keyhole and a jammed lock. Miss Gray's keen eyes had already noticed the faint drag mark on the worn carpet just inside, as though someone had moved the body after death, not with urgency, but with a peculiar care, as if rearranging a detail in a scene meant to suggest one story while hiding another. Later, while sipping her tea in the lounge, Miss Gray inquired, almost carelessly, whether anyone else had received misdelivered correspondence that morning, and it was the maid, young Hattie with her two wide eyes and trembling hands, who mentioned the note tucked under the wrong door, addressed simply to R in looping ink. No sender, no context, just two words. He knows. The housekeeper, Mrs. Druitt, pale and stiff with guilt she refused to name, confessed later to having reassigned the room at the last moment under quiet instructions from a mysterious guest who checked in with cash and no ID, an old friend, he claimed, of someone no one at the inn could recall ever existing. In the drawing room, Mr. Thornhill, a retired illusionist with a fondness for theatrics and shadows, spoke of seeing someone the night before wearing a dark coat lined in crimson silk, slipping through the hall just after midnight, walking like a man who doesn't want to be heard, but also doesn't care if he's seen. Miss Gray's fingers paused on her embroidery, noting the time of sighting matched the moment the grandfather clock had stopped ticking. Whispers of blackmail drifted in the corners of conversation, always cloaked in vague allusions, talk of a scandal buried years ago, a betrayal tied to the estate's long-forgotten south wing that had remained closed since the fire. The telegram, which had vanished from the front desk tray, was said to have contained coordinates, not words, and the gardener, who rarely spoke, claimed he found ash and torn parchment beneath the rose trellis that morning. A man with no name, a message meant for no one, and a room that should have been locked all converged into a riddle only fear dared keep unsolved. And as Miss Gray returned to her quarters, her expression remained unreadable, save for the faint tightening at the corners of her mouth, the only sign she had begun to piece together, what everyone else so desperately wished to forget, that the dead man had never meant to die in room 9, but someone else had, and perhaps, just perhaps, someone still would. The old manor, recently converted into a hotel, still echoed with the silence of decades, and this time, the silence wasn't just about forgotten stories. Miss Elspeth Rowley, a quiet guest whose knitting needles often paused not for dropped stitches, but for the subtle shifts in human expression, was sitting in the lobby that afternoon, when Mrs. Calloway, the hotel manager, emerged pale-faced and trembling, as she arranged the bills on the reception desk like they might somehow make sense of the unease gathering in the walls. "It was an accident," she said, almost whispering, "but it feels like we opened something that should have stayed closed." Miss Rowley, ever calm, asked what she meant, and the answer came hesitantly. "The attic room, room 17. It had been locked for years, the key was missing, but we opened it last week, and this morning, a stranger was found dead inside. No name, no records, it's like he just appeared." Miss Rowley's knitting paused mid-loop. "Or perhaps," she said slowly, "he entered the wrong room, looking for something else." Later, Millie, the young and spirited maid who often knew more than she let on, shared something unsettling while polishing the dining room mirrors. "A telegram came this morning, looked old-fashioned, but the ink was fresh. It was left with the breakfast tray for a Miss Harlan, except the envelope was just marked E." Miss Rowley asked what it said. Millie hesitated, then whispered, "Return at once. You are not safe." Warnings like that aren't sent by mistake. Miss Rowley knew that. That evening, over a half glass of sherry, Colonel Avery muttered something odd. "I saw someone on the landing last night. Long coat. Didn't walk, just floated past. Head covered." The next morning, Mrs. Etheridge reluctantly echoed the sighting. A woman this time, cloaked in black, moving through the side gate. I couldn't see her face, but her walk, it was like the ground didn't want her there. A pattern was forming, slowly in fragments, but clear. Miss Rowley ventured down the older corridor that evening, the one where linens whispered and secrets lingered behind neatly closed doors. She passed two maids, Lottie and Jane, their voices low but their fear tangible. That room was never normal. Lottie said. There was a fire years ago, but the body they found wasn't burned, just still, like something froze the life out of him. Miss Rowley bent to adjust her sock, listening. Then Jane spoke. They say that room remembers people, not just the living ones. The ones the world has forgotten. That night Millie returned with one more story, the kind that hides in the folds of dust and memory. A year ago, a guest would come down every morning, humming an old tune. No one knew the song. One day, he vanished. No checkout, no luggage, nothing. Just a half-full teacup left behind. And sometimes, when someone new stays in that room, steam still rises from it. Miss Rowley's gaze drifted to the staircase that curled upward toward room 17. Perhaps the room doesn't trap people, she murmured. Maybe it just remembers them, especially the ones no one else does. And perhaps, later that night, someone heard the click of the doorknob turning, even though the hallway appeared empty, or at least, it seemed to be. The dawn broke in a ghostly hush over Windermere Hotel, with fog curling like fingers around the aging spires and ivy-choked windows. And though the sea was silent, something unseen moved beneath its stillness, and within the hotel walls, something long buried had begun to stir. Miss Alara Vane, a woman of quiet grace and unnerving intuition, had been drawn to this seaside retreat for rest, but rest was the one thing this place refused to offer. The night before, a guest had been found lifeless in room 9, a room that should not have existed at all, its very presence erased from all official plans, blueprints, and modern maps, and yet somehow, inexplicably, it stood at the end of a corridor that always seemed slightly too long, slightly too cold. Whispers had already begun, hushed tones in the dining hall, darting glances among the staff, the sudden nervous absence of Ruth the maid, who had earlier told Miss Vane that her great-aunt used to speak of the Windermere as a place where people checked in, but didn't always check out, especially those who stayed in rooms the building itself didn't seem to want. The dead man had no identification, only a suitcase full of clothing that didn't match his frame. A newspaper clipping from 1961 folded tightly into a hollowed-out book, and a silver pocket watch that had stopped at exactly 3:13 a.m. The hour when guests had reported hearing footsteps in places no one was walking. Alara noticed things others missed, the faint smell of brine clinging to the doorknob, though the windows were shut tight, the dusty outline on the shelf where a second suitcase had clearly rested, the strange angle of the man's shoes which suggested he hadn't collapsed, but had been carefully placed. Later that day, when the others were occupied with frantic calls and contradictory stories, she walked the garden paths, pretending to admire the lavender, until something behind the ivy-crawled stone wall caught her eye. A pale hand, limp, its knuckles bruised. It was Mr. Renville, the groundskeeper, his face slack and colorless, his shirt soaked through with dew and a narrow wound at his temple, almost surgically clean. The maid Gladys screamed, dropping a basket of linens as the hotel erupted in chaos, and Colonel Denby barked orders no one listened to. Miss Vane remained calm, her gloved hand resting lightly on Mr. Renville's chest. Yes, faint breathing, but her attention was fixed not on the man, but on the strip of paper poking from his inner jacket, waterlogged and smudged with the words, "You found room 9, don't find the others," scrawled in trembling ink. She slipped it free before anyone noticed, her mind racing. If room 9 was real, what about the rumors of hidden rooms beneath the East Wing? What about the locked cellar that the manager, Mr. Illing, claimed was under renovation, yet from which candlelight had been seen flickering during the storm? That evening, after Renville was taken inside and declared merely exhausted, Alara studied the paper, and then the old photograph she'd retrieved from the tin box earlier. 2 men in military uniform, one of them unmistakably a younger Mr. Elling, the other with a blurred face and the same ring the dead man in room 9 had worn. The next morning, a new guest was found weeping in the hallway, swearing she saw a man staring through the mirror in her room, not behind her, but from within it, as if trapped behind glass. Miss Vane returned once more to room 9, now sealed and marked staff only, and noticed something chilling. The wall behind the headboard was hollow. She moved it, pushed, and a small door swung inward into darkness, the air stale and cold, and there on the stone floor lay 3 old suitcases, a woman's shoe, and a hotel ledger half burned, with 7 names, all marked checked in, none marked checked out. Her hand trembled only slightly as she stepped in, the door swinging shut behind her with a dull finality, and the last thing visible before the shadows took her was a cracked mirror, and in it, her own reflection, smiling back though she herself was not. The sun had barely dipped behind the jagged cliffs, when an unsettling quiet crept through the Marigold house, that genteel coastal retreat, whose name evoked blooming peace, but whose walls Eleanor Gray knew too well, echoed with something more sinister, like muffled cries swallowed by time. That evening, something had shifted in the air, the kind of stillness that sinks into your bones and warns you someone is hiding something. It was room 13 again, unlucky by name, damning by design, where the dead man was found crumpled near the fireplace, not like someone caught by surprise, but as if he'd known his end had followed him there, right to the threshold of this so-called sanctuary. Eleanor, with her calm eyes and unhurried movements, had entered quietly after the authorities left, her presence never fully acknowledged, but never quite unnoticed either. She had no need to read the worn writing, scrawled on the back of the photograph she uncovered, hidden behind the warped panel near the hearth. The ink nearly vanished, but the face is clearer than truth. She saw him there, the deceased in his youth, beside another man whose eyes were unmistakable, sharp, guarded, hollowed, not by age but memory. That second face belonged to Mr. Hargrove, the estate's elusive proprietor, whose name was spoken with equal parts reverence and reluctance. He had claimed ignorance, that he had never seen the man before, but Eleanor had caught the slight tremble in his glass, as she mentioned the photograph, the flicker in his gaze, that darted not in confusion but in calculation. That night, a hush settled over the guests, not the silence of grief but the quiet dread of truths, breathing just beneath the surface. Conversations dulled, glances sharpened, even the clink of china seemed too loud, too dangerous. Colonel Whitmore, who once lectured her on sea air and salt remedies, now passed her in the corridor with downcast eyes. Mrs. Linton, always so steady with her tea tray, spilled a full cup onto the lace without apology, and young Clarissa, bright chatty Clarissa, barely mumbled a word, as if the very act of speaking might pull old ghosts into the light. That night, Eleanor waited outside Hargrove's door, her breath slow, her posture still. She wasn't eavesdropping, not in the traditional sense. She was listening for fear, for shame, for the old ghosts that never die, but wait, patient, until someone cracks just wide enough to let them speak. And she heard them, not clearly, but enough. Hushed words exchanged behind thick oak, mentions of a debt that was never repaid, and a warning whispered through clenched teeth. He said he'd come back and he did. Much later, in the privacy of her own room, Eleanor found her window unlatched, though she distinctly remembered fastening it just after sunset, and on the edge of her writing desk an object had been moved, not stolen, merely touched, like someone reminding her they had been there. On the floor she found a single black thread, one that didn't match her clothes or the curtains, curled like a question mark. Then came the sound, not a knock, not even a breath, but a shuffle, too cautious to be a guest, too quiet to be a servant. Someone stood beyond her door listening, waiting. She didn't rise, she simply sat, composed, hairbrush paused mid-stroke, knowing full well that something had shifted. She was no longer the observer. She had become the disturbance. Someone had noticed she was getting close. And that, she thought with a strange calm, meant she was finally on the right path. The man in room 13 hadn't just died. He had been silenced, perhaps decades too late. And whatever had been buried with him had started to claw its way back through floorboards and faded memories. In places like Marigold House, where the walls were thick and reputations thicker, the past never stayed dead. It merely waited, coiled, hungry and patient, for someone foolish enough to dig. Everyone at the Seawood Inn had their own version of the past, diluted memories and carefully cropped truths. But Miss Elspeth Ward had long learned that in places like these the most dangerous thing wasn't what people remembered, it was what they deliberately forgot. She arrived with nothing more than a small valise, and the kind of stillness that unsettles a room, dressed in soft greys like the horizon before a storm, her silver hair pinned with military precision, and eyes that missed nothing. They called it a tragic incident. Room 9, Seaside View. A man found lifeless with no signs of forced entry, no blood, just stillness, as if death had slipped in unnoticed like the tide. But Elspeth, sipping weak tea near the fire and knitting something that never grew longer, had already begun seeing beneath the fabric of the inn, where the wallpaper peeled like old secrets and the floor groaned under memories too heavy to carry. At the local church hall, during a clumsy afternoon bake sale, she sat beside Mrs. Fenwick, a widow with trembling hands and eyes that darted like birds, who after 2 ciders, whispered about men in long coats who came at night during the war, the ones who never looked anyone in the eye, dear and smelled like foreign cigarettes. The staff avoided room 9, like it carried infection, and the bellboy Reggie, nervously fiddling with his tie, admitted to once dropping a spoon that disappeared between the floorboards. He'd reached for it and found instead a scrap of paper etched with numbers he couldn't understand, burned on the edges, like someone meant to destroy it. And then there was the whisper, the black ledger, a wartime artifact rumored to list names, transactions, betrayals too valuable to forget, and too dangerous to remember. It was said to have vanished with Elias Mercer in 1944, a British intelligence officer last seen boarding a skiff that never made it back to shore. But the corpse in room 9 wasn't just anyone. It was him. Miss Ward knew it before the constable did, long before the telegram arrived from London confirming the fingerprints matched Mercer's old file. Funny how he resurfaced, Harris said over dry toast, not noticing how her hands had stilled. But Elspeth, who had once sat in smoky rooms filled with codes and consequences, understood that Mercer hadn't returned by accident. Someone had summoned him, perhaps to reclaim what he took, or to silence him before he spoke. The chambermaid Nora confessed, in a whisper she swore she'd deny, that she'd seen a woman, no longer young, but striking in a sharp sort of way, exit room 9, the night before the body was found, carrying a leather folder she didn't have when she went in. Elspeth didn't need names. She understood the scent of unfinished business. The past had teeth, and in places like the Seawood Inn, where wallpaper hid bullet holes and cellars still echoed footsteps from another era, stories had a way of clawing their way back into the light. Mercer had come seeking closure, or justice, but someone else had come seeking silence. And now the inn, with its sea-damp linens and creaking corridors, was holding its breath, waiting to see who would speak next, or disappear. They always said the sea kept its secrets, but this time, it had returned one soaked and silent, as if compelled by guilt. The man found in room 17 was not just another lost soul. He was Ernest Vale, a name spoken in whispers and forgotten in official reports, declared drowned off the coast during the war, presumed dead when a storm swallowed both his small boat and every trace of him. And yet, 3 decades later, here he was, face grey, lips tinged with sea salt, his suitcase still damp, and a strange rusted key in his hand, one that didn't match any known lock in the entire building. Miss Isabel Harrow, who had resided in the hotel longer than the ivy that choked its balconies, didn't bat an eyelid. She simply looked toward the west wing, where the cliffs met the sea, and resumed the same slow embroidery she had been stitching since the 1950s, as if threads and patterns could distract her from the ghosts that walked in flesh. She remembered him, of course, remembered the precise set of his shoulders, the scar above his brow, and the secret meetings in the east cellar, long past midnight, back when blackouts cloaked more than just light. When the young receptionist brought her the news, his name, his face, the fact that no one saw him enter, and yet he was found dead, locked from the inside. Miss Harrow merely murmured, "How peculiar," but her mind was already racing through shadows she'd never let go of. That evening, in the conservatory thick with fern and shadow, she found Mrs. Redcliffe, widow of the hotel's former manager, furiously pruning already dying flowers with trembling hands. The past does bloom strangely in places like this, Miss Harrow said quietly, watching her, especially when the roots were never dug up. Mrs. Redcliffe flinched. Her confession was not offered easily. It came in fragments, broken by long pauses, and too many glances toward the sea. Vale had been her husband's closest confidant, she said, until one evening something shattered between them. There was shouting, and then silence, the kind of silence that lingers and grows teeth. He said he was protecting something, or someone, she whispered, but others said he was trading secret, not just black market goods, but people's names, resistance fighters, deserters, targets. Her voice cracked. He vanished before the inquiry could catch up with him. Miss Harrow said nothing, but she remembered the secret staircase in the East Wing, the one bricked up quietly in 45, and the man who disappeared after one last meeting in the cellar, a meeting no one ever spoke of. Later, over a slow smoky brandy with Major Braithwaite, she pressed further. The Major, red-faced and stiff in his old wool uniform, wouldn't meet her gaze. Some of us made arrangements, he muttered. There were shipments, radio parts, intelligence, smuggling, yes, but no one got hurt. Miss Harrow's eyes narrowed. But someone did, didn't they? She asked, and silence was his only reply. In truth, she knew more than she ever let on. She had once followed Vale through the tunnels beneath the hotel, had seen the coded ledgers hidden behind a false panel in the laundry room, had read the names etched in his notebook, names of people who had vanished without a trace during the war. And now, with his body returned like a message in a bottle, she knew this was no accident. Someone had let him in. Someone still here, still breathing, had known who he was and what he carried. Perhaps they thought he wouldn't speak. Perhaps they made sure of it. But the sea had chosen not to keep him. The dead return when the living forget to be afraid, she whispered to herself. And that night, as waves crashed against the cliffside and room 17 remained under lock and key, Miss Harrow sat in the lounge once more, her embroidery left untouched. Her eyes scanned each guest, every hand stirring tea, every glance a little too quick to turn away, and she knew with a certainty as deep as the tide, that the hotel had never truly buried its secrets. It had merely waited, and now, one by one, the walls would whisper again. While others gossiped like restless birds, oblivious to the undercurrents pulsing through the faded walls of the Royal Gull Hotel, Miss Elspeth Hargrove's hands moved with deceptive calm across her knitting, smooth, precise, as if nothing around her ever disturbed the rhythm of her thoughts. Yet her ears missed nothing. The talk of officers and civilians during the war had always unsettled her, men who wore medals by day, and moved black market cargo by moonlight, barely better than pirates cloaked in patriotism. Colonel Ashbury, red-faced and stiff in manner, leaned closer over his teacup, his voice lowered with a strange mix of disdain and nostalgia. Always suspected Sanderfeld was up to his neck in something shady, he muttered, trying to keep his tone casual, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of old guilt. When a man vanishes so completely, it's usually not chance, he added grimly. Miss Hargrove's smile was faint, unreadable, but her mind was already 10 steps ahead. In her experience, war never truly ended. It merely changed form, retreating into memory where it could rot slowly, festering until something, or someone, brought it back to the surface. That night, alone in her dimly lit room that still smelled faintly of lavender and sea-damp wood, she unfolded the Britwell photograph she had taken from Mr. Linwood's effects, hidden carefully in the inner pocket of his soaked blazer. The image was worn, its edges furled from too much hiding, but the faces were unmistakable. A younger Linwood stood stiffly to the side, flanked by another man with sharper cheekbones and stormy eyes, the corpse from room 13, now identified as Thomas Marsden. But what made her heart falter for just a breath was the cursive beneath the photo, still barely legible, Sanderfeld, 1943. She folded the picture with care, the significance weighing heavily. This wasn't a holiday snapshot, it was a fragment of truth that refused to stay buried. Marsden had known Sanderfeld, Linwood had known them both, and someone perhaps still walking the hotel's creaking corridors, had feared what Marsden might say. The following morning brought no peace, only a whisper delivered in hushed tones by Gladys, the maid with wide eyes and trembling hands who leaned in breathlessly during breakfast. "She's gone," Gladys said, voice quivering. Mrs. Sanderfeld packed a bag and vanished before dawn. Miss Hargrove set her spoon down with a kind of reverence, folding her hands as if in silent prayer, though her eyes narrowed slightly. "That seems rather sudden," she murmured, but Gladys was already fumbling through her apron, producing a crumpled envelope, its ink smudged and edges curled with desperation. "She left this for you," the girl whispered. The envelope bore only a few frantic words. "For Miss Hargrove, private please." The note inside was thin, the hotel's stationery, spotted with the imprint of a trembling grip. "You are the only one who understands. Please protect the innocent. The past has found me, and I cannot face it. Forgive me." No name, no return, just the faint outline of a smeared signature, where the pen had snagged mid-regret. Miss Hargrove's expression didn't change, but inside, the gears of her mind turned with terrifying clarity. She had seen this before, the ghosts of wartime surfacing in seemingly idyllic places, where linen was crisp and secrets festered just beneath the lace. "What shall we do?" Gladys asked, almost gleeful in her fright. "Nothing, dear," Miss Hargrove replied softly. "Those who flee rarely get far." But she was already thinking, not of the woman who had vanished, but of who she had been trying to protect. Because no one ever runs alone. There is always a trail, and someone innocent was now tangled in the noose meant for the guilty. Later that morning, Colonel Ashbury came puffing in like a winded dog, cheeks red, clutching a faded handbag. "Left it here on the hall table," he exclaimed, as if this small discovery vindicated his relevance. "Careless if you ask me." Miss Hargrove took the bag in silence, noting the frayed stitching, the way the clasp had been bent and repaired too many times. Signs of a woman once elegant, now weary. She opened it not with force, but reverence, as if unwrapping a bomb whose ticking had long been ignored. Inside, among tissues and a compact mirror cracked down the center, was a folded letter and a single brass key, one that didn't match any door in the hotel, and that, she thought with chilling certainty, was because it wasn't meant to. It was meant for something locked decades ago, perhaps in the cellar where the sea salt never left the walls. She glanced up, the wind rattling the window just once, and in that fleeting silence, Miss Hargrove knew, the storm wasn't coming. It had already begun. The morning mist clung stubbornly to the edges of the Royal Gull Hotel, wrapping its ivy-draped walls in a shroud of damp silence, that felt less like weather, and more like warning. Miss Helena Winfield, a woman whose presence had always been more felt than seen, sat in her modest corner room surrounded by the faint scent of old wool, lavender oil, and quiet dread. On the table before her rested the leather satchel left behind by the mysteriously vanished Mrs. Ellery, untouched since its discovery, beside the half-finished cup of tea she never returned to. Helena's fingers, thin but sure, moved through the contents like a historian sorting artifacts from a time no one dared discuss aloud. A lace handkerchief embroidered with the faded initials V, a battered tin of lozenges whose lid barely held on, a delicate gold watch that had stopped at 11:46, and tucked beneath the lining, like a secret too heavy to carry openly, a thick tarnished iron key marked with a brass tag that simply read, "Master, Room 9. The weight of it was unsettling, not just physically, but in implication. Room 9 was never assigned, never spoken of. Its door remained locked behind layers of paint and generations of excuses. Helena's breath caught as decades of silence shifted in her memory. That room had not merely held furniture and forgotten linens, it had held agreements, forged under the weight of war and betrayal. She recalled the photograph she'd found wedged behind the drawer in her wardrobe. Only 2 days prior, 4 individuals, laughing young, unaware, posed on the hotel's back lawn, dated July 1942. One of them was unmistakably a young Mrs. Ellery, her smile tight, her posture defensive. Another was the man recently found dead in room 6, his neck broken not by accident, but by intent. The other two, one presumed long dead in combat, and the other believed to have fled the country with forged papers, were names only whispered in old files, and intelligence reports that Helena, in another life, had been tasked to catalogue, during her time in military records. Ivy, the maid who had unknowingly brought the satchel to Helena, was the newest arrival, barely 19, full of hope and ignorance. But the note found within the satchel scrawled in panic, read "Protect her, she does not know what she carries." And Helena understood. Ivy was never meant to know, but someone now feared she might. The murder had not been a mistake of passion, it was the panic of unfinished business, a war promise broken and buried under decades of pretense. Whoever had returned to the Royal Gull did so with a purpose, and when the wrong person was killed, perhaps in mistaken identity, perhaps to send a message, it only meant the real target was still breathing. At breakfast the next morning, as the dining room clattered with forced small talk and clinking china, Helena gently steered the conversation with Mrs. Fenwick, the hotel's oldest guest and its most shameless gossip, toward the topic of sealed rooms and the curious way war changes people. The reaction was immediate, a stiffening of posture, a tremor in her teacup, and a too hasty reassurance that those days were long behind us. But Helena knew better. Guilt doesn't age gracefully, it lingers, curdles and waits. And now, with the master key in her pocket, the photograph hidden under her shawl, and the unmistakable sensation that she was being watched from behind the velvet curtains of the lobby, Helena Winfield understood one thing with absolute certainty. The past was not finished with the Royal Gull, and someone still here was prepared to kill again, to ensure the truth never escaped. Room 9. The air inside the old drawing room had grown unnervingly heavy, as though time itself had paused to listen, pressing against the windows and seeping into the cracks between the wooden floorboards, waiting, almost reverently, for the reckoning that had been postponed far too long. Miss Althea Kershaw, draped in faded lavender and framed by shadows, sat poised in her antique high-backed chair, with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in silence. The letter she had sent to each guest was deceptively cordial, an invitation dressed in politeness, masking the storm brewing beneath. Now, as they trickled in, there was no mistaking the unease etched onto each face. Major Hargrove lingered near the fireplace, stiff-backed and coiled with the paranoia of an old soldier who sensed an ambush, but couldn't locate the sniper. Beatrice Lane, ever the elegant widow, clutched her handbag too tightly, knuckles white, eyes darting like a moth trapped in lamplight. Mr. Ellis arrived last, smelling faintly of whiskey and dread, his eyes bloodshot not from drink, but from sleepless nights, haunted by a name he never thought he'd hear again. Frances Bell. And Eleanor, frail, quiet Eleanor, sat closest to the hearth with a ghostly stillness, as if shrinking from the heat of truth itself. The fire crackled, not warmly, but urgently, its flames casting long twitching shadows that seemed to reach for the guests like spectral fingers. Then Miss Kershaw, after a deliberate moment of silence, finally spoke. "It is a dreadful thing, isn't it?" she said softly, "when the past we thought we buried begins to dig its way back up." Her voice was gentle, but every word fell with surgical precision. "A man came here last week, registered under a false name, took room 11, within 2 days, he was dead. But Frances Bell was no stranger to this house, nor to any of you." Her gaze swept the room like a scalpel. "He was part of what we did, what we chose to forget, what we all allowed to happen under this very roof during the war, smuggling, stolen identities, falsified deaths, things we justified once under the name of survival." A hush blanketed the room, but Belle did not return for vengeance. She continued, her tone sharpening. "He came back for leverage. He carried documents, originals, proof of what we all buried, and he meant to sell them." Her hand moved over a faded envelope, thick, sealed, edges worn like bones unearthed after years in the dirt. "But someone among us panicked, someone killed him. The irony, of course, is that they killed the wrong man. Belle was merely the carrier. The real threat, the one person who has everything, is still alive." Beatrice let out a faint gasp. Ellis paled. Hargrove's mouth tightened, and Eleanor finally looked up, her eyes reflecting both innocence and something disturbingly unreadable. Miss Kershaw leaned forward, her voice now razor-thin. So you see, we are gathered not just to mourn a death, but to confront a living danger. The murderer sits among us, as does the true keeper of our sins, and before the sun sets on this day, I intend to unmask them both. Not for justice, justice is far too clean a word, but for truth. Because after 30 years of silence, the past has decided it will not wait quietly any longer. Marsden's return to the Royal Gull was never born of sentiment, it was forged in the cold fire of old wounds, and the echo of footsteps that once fled in the dark, a reckoning long postponed, but never forgotten. He didn't come seeking comfort or closure, he came to finish what had begun in blood and betrayal decades ago, to stare into the eyes of the man who had once held his fate like a noose. But as he burst into room 14, heart hammering with fury and dread, it wasn't the face from his nightmares that met him, but that of a stranger, calm, still, and quietly watching the fire as though expecting him. Time froze in that surreal moment, the only sound the rhythmic crackle of flames devouring wood. And Marsden's breath caught as the weight of an unforgivable error pressed against his chest. The wrong man lay dead. And yet perhaps fate had not missed its mark entirely, for Mr. Pritchard, though not the intended target, bore sins of his own, sins steeped in wartime shadows, where loyalty and treachery danced hand in hand, and where secrets were bartered like currency. From the bay window, Miss Elira Morel observed it all with the serene detachment of one who already knew how the story would end, her gentle smile, the kind that forms when clarity arrives after years of fog. "Curious, isn't it?" she murmured, her voice barely breaking the tension, but slicing through it all the same. "How the threads we so desperately try to cut manage to weave themselves together, when we least expect it." Her gaze shifted, sharp and unflinching, landing on Miss Whitford, who sat frozen mid-sip, her teacup trembling ever so slightly, betraying the storm within. "You see," Miss Morel continued, with a soft relentlessness, "the true question was never about who pulled the trigger, but who was most terrified that Marsden had returned." A silence thicker than smoke settled over the room, and with chilling gentleness, she answered the question herself. "It was you, wasn't it, Mrs. Whitford?" The older woman gave a brittle laugh, but the blood had drained from her face, and her lace handkerchief twisted in her grasp like a lifeline slipping away. "Ridiculous," she whispered. "Why would I?" But Miss Morel's voice, calm and devastating, offered no refuge. "Because once, a long time ago, you loved a man who lived on the edge of law and loyalty, a smuggler whose smile disarmed you, and whose secrets bound you to a life you never chose. And in trusting you, he handed you a truth too dangerous to keep, but too precious to betray. So you buried it, deep, and spent the years since guarding not just your name, but his memory. When Marsden came back, asking questions, walking through these halls like a ghost returned to collect his due, you panicked. Not for yourself perhaps, but for the fragile image of a man you still mourned. You thought he'd come to expose it all, to shame you, to demand silence with coin you could no longer offer. And so in the suffocating dark of fear and memory, you crept into a room you thought was his, and struck. The words hovered like smoke. "But it wasn't Marsden you found. It was Pritchard. A man whose own past, as it turns out, wasn't innocent either. Still, it was not justice. It was fear. A fear born from love." The handkerchief slipped from Mrs. Whitford's hand and floated to the floor like a fallen truth, and her voice when it came was barely audible. "I only ever wanted to protect him." Miss Morel nodded with aching softness, rising as if the weight of understanding had finally settled. "And that," she said, smoothing the front of her skirt, "is what makes this tragedy so terribly human. Because it was never about greed or ambition. It was about love. The kind that scars, that lingers in shadows long after the world has moved on. The kind that drives people to sacrifice everything, even their soul, for a memory that cannot love them back." No one moved. Colonel Denham stared blankly at the threadbare rug, his earlier bluster replaced by quiet shame. Miss Cotter's knitting needles hung motionless, gripped tightly in trembling hands. Outside, the wind hissed against the windows, carrying the sound of waves that had long since stopped caring about the affairs of men. And then Miss Morel, voice quiet but immovable, delivered her final words like a verdict from time itself. The past doesn't vanish, no matter how carefully we bury it. It waits, it watches, and when the moment is right, it returns, not with vengeance but with truth. By midday, the hotel stirred back into motion, but an invisible weight hung in the air, something unspoken like the echo of thunder long after the storm has passed. Guests whispered over breakfast with eyes that didn't quite meet. Mrs. Whitford sat alone by the wide salt-fogged window, watching the sea with a haunted tenderness, as though waiting for someone who would never walk the shore again. Colonel Denham pretended to read his newspaper, while glancing often at the fireplace, and Miss Morrel, as composed as ever, sipped her tea and said nothing more. She didn't need to. The story had ended, not with handcuffs or shouting, but with a silence far louder than guilt. The truth, after all, had been uncovered gently, but it had cut deep, and as the tide rolled in, indifferent and eternal, the guests at the Royal Gull Hotel quietly understood what Miss Morrel had always known. No matter how far you run or how deeply you bury your sins, the past never forgets. It only waits for the moment you're forced to remember. Knitting with an elegance that belied the chaos recently unearthed, Miss Elira Morrel's hands remained perfectly steady, as though murder, smuggling and secrets buried beneath decades of silence were no more unsettling than a dropped stitch in soft wool. And yet, her eyes told a different story, fixed, narrowed slightly, haunted not by what had been revealed, but by what hadn't. There was something still unraveling at the edge of her mind, a single irregular loop in the tightly woven tapestry of deception that refused to lay flat. For in all her years across manors, moors and maritime inns, Miss Morrel had learned that true evil never struts. It whispers, hides and tidies itself up with obsessive precision. The story as it stood now was clean, almost too clean, and human nature, she knew, detested clean endings. As the soft knock came, the quiet click of the door ushered in young Ivy Gladys, cheeks flushed with urgency and tea tray wobbling as her voice dropped into a breathless whisper. Miss Morrel, the key. I forgot with all the excitement. The key to Mrs. Averil's room. She left it behind. Polished like a mirror. No prints, nothing. Miss Morrel didn't blink, didn't speak, but her needles froze mid-motion. A key deliberately wiped free, left behind by a woman who was supposedly running in haste. No, people do not polish what they flee from. They polish what they're leaving behind deliberately, perhaps to send a message or erase one. Her voice, when it came, was soft but edged with curiosity. And no one saw her go. Gladys shook her head, wide-eyed. No one, just the key, sitting at the desk like it was waiting for someone. A peculiar silence followed. Then the gentle rhythm of knitting, though Miss Morrel's thoughts had already detached from the parlor, and slipped into darker corners of the Royal Viridian Inn. It was too quiet a vanishing, too considered, rising with the grace of someone who never rushed, but always arrived at the truth exactly when it was ready to be seen. Miss Morrel excused herself. She wandered the carpeted halls, her gloves brushing the cool brass railings, until she stood outside room 9, Mrs. Averil's supposed quarters. There had been no bags taken, no murmured goodbyes, no signs of exit, just the suspicious absence of disturbance. And to Miss Morrel, absence was often the loudest clue. She turned almost casually, and made her way to the back stairwell, the one maids and repairmen used, forgotten by most guests, but well remembered by someone who had once escaped a Balkan shootout through a wine cellar in 42. Up the narrow passage, past the brittle scent of mothballs and the sigh of ancient wood, she ascended to the attic. She knew before she opened it, and there, huddled beneath dust-draped furniture and fragments of forgotten lives, was Mrs. Averil, her hair wild, cheeks streaked with tears, and in her trembling hand, a yellowed photograph. A man in uniform, smiling with secrets behind his eyes. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, as if truth itself could be banished by shame. But Miss Morrel simply stepped closer, her voice like a balm to a wound that had festered too long. No one ever vanishes cleanly, my dear. They only hide. And even then, she gently lifted the photo, they take their ghosts with them. In that stillness, amidst dust and fading daylight, the real story unraveled, not just of murder or espionage, but of a woman who had been guarding not only a lie, but the last piece of a man the world had forgotten. Miss Marple did not judge her, she simply held her hand, and together they let silence speak, for some truths do not need confession, they simply need to be understood. The sea breeze whispered secrets through the narrow hallway of the old coastal hotel, slipping beneath doors and around corners like a ghost that refused to rest. On the top floor, in a room where the wallpaper had begun to peel like old memories, Miss Eliza Hartley sat in a faded armchair, with a diary in her lap, its leather cover cracked and soft from age, its pages brimming with someone else's sorrow. Her eyes, sharp and unrelenting, scanned each line as if decoding more than words, as if each letter was a clue, each sentence a key. Across the room, Mary, the soft-spoken receptionist with worry etched into her brow, stood clutching a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. "Miss Hartley," she said, her voice trembling like glass, "there's something I forgot to tell you. The night Mrs. Lovelace disappeared, she left her room key at the front desk, but it was spotless, polished like someone had wiped it clean." Eliza's eyes flickered with something that wasn't quite surprise. No, it was confirmation. Slowly, deliberately, she closed the diary and looked up. "No one leaves a key like that unless they want you to believe they're gone for good," she murmured. That evening, long after most guests had settled into their dinners and drinks, Miss Hartley descended the staff staircase in silence, her shoes tapping softly against the old wood. She knew the path well by now, she had walked it twice already in her mind. She reached the attic door, aged and slightly ajar, the kind of door that creaks in dreams and thrillers. Inside, the air was stale and thick with forgotten stories. There, crouched in the dim light filtering through the slats, was Mrs. Lovelace, her once pristine hair disheveled, her eyes wide with fatigue and fear. In her trembling hands, she held a letter stained with what looked like dried blood. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, voice brittle with dread and longing. Eliza stepped closer, her presence calm but undeniable. "Secrets don't stay buried, not when someone's still listening," she replied softly. And then the truth poured out, heavy and unstoppable. How Mrs. Lovelace's husband hadn't slipped from that cliff by accident. How the smuggling ring, thought to be dismantled decades ago, had merely gone underground, its members now hidden in plain sight, wearing tailored suits and sipping wine beside the unsuspecting. How a whisper overheard in the dead of night had turned her from a grieving widow into a marked woman. Eliza took the letter, reading its jagged scrawl with unwavering focus. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but steady. "Truth is like fire, it burns when held too long. But it's only in the light that we see what's truly there." Downstairs, the waves began their slow march back toward the shore, crashing softly against stone and memory. Later, standing on the misty promenade with Mary by her side, Eliza watched the tide roll in with an expression that blended weariness and resolution. "Do you think it's finally over?" Mary asked, her voice hushed as though the sea itself might be listening. Eliza's gaze lingered on the horizon, where water met sky in a blur of silver and smoke. "Nothing ever ends," she said quietly, "it only transforms. People bury the truth, thinking they've silenced it. But secrets are like tide water, they always find a way back." And with that, she turned toward the hotel, her steps light yet decisive, as though she walked not away from the past, but straight through it, carrying with her every shadow she'd uncovered, and leaving behind only the sound of waves washing sins into the sea.